I had always believed that in business, numbers were the ultimate truth. Numbers don't bend to bias, they don't listen to rumors, and they don't favor politics. They simply tell the story of effort, precision, and outcome. For more than 10 years, I had built my reputation on that principle. When departments stumbled, I stabilized them. When projects bled money, I sealed the leaks. When investors hesitated, I showed them frameworks that converted doubt into confidence. But in this company, truth wasn't enough. One false whisper from HR carried more weight than a decade of performance. The warning signs were subtle at first. A report circulating with my signature, except it wasn't mine. A financial summary altered just enough to raise suspicion. Colleagues who once sought my guidance now avoided eye contact. I knew the rhythm of corporate maneuvering, but this was different. It wasn't rivalry, it was execution. Someone wanted me erased. The summons came on a Monday morning. A terse calendar invite from HR, meeting with CEO, 9 a.m. No subject line, no agenda. I walked into the conference room and found them already waiting, CEO at the head of the table, HR director at his side. Their posture told me everything. This wasn't a discussion. This was a sentence. The HR director began, her voice deliberately steady, as if she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. We've completed an internal review. Concerns have been raised about your handling of compliance documentation and financial reporting. There are discrepancies, serious ones. In light of this, leadership has decided your position here is no longer tenable. I didn't flinch. I didn't protest. I knew every ledger, every audit trail, every transaction I had touched. My record was spotless. The so-called discrepancies were manufactured. But in that room, evidence didn't matter. The CEO wasn't looking for truth, he was looking for a scapegoat. He leaned forward, his tone final. You've become a liability. Effective immediately, you are terminated. He said it as though firing me was a favor to the company, as though I hadn't given more than a decade of discipline, as though my contributions were nothing but clutter in his way. HR slid a folder across the table. Inside were the fabricated reports, altered figures, manipulated summaries, carefully crafted to look authentic. If I refused to sign the exit documents, they would spread the allegations further. They wanted me out, disgraced, and silent. I closed the folder, stood up, and looked the CEO directly in the eye. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. Arguing would only dignify their lie. Instead, I left the room with the kind of silence that unsettles people more than words ever could. What they didn't know was simple. Firing me didn't erase me. It only freed me. Because while HR had built her lie, and the CEO had delivered his sentence, both of them had overlooked one crucial fact: I was not just an employee. I was the architect of the very capital structures that kept their empire standing. Years ago, when the company was still fighting for relevance, I had been the one negotiating with investors. Those investors had demanded safeguards, clauses that protected their money from being mishandled by reckless executives. One such clause placed oversight of $50 million directly under my authority. I was the designated signatory. My approval was required for withdrawals, reallocations, or liquidations of that fund. At the time, the CEO barely noticed. To him, it was just paperwork. To me, it was foresight. I knew leaders come and go, boards shift, and politics rot good companies from the inside. That clause was my insurance. And now, it had become my weapon. Back in my office, I didn't cry. I didn't pack in a rush. I moved slowly, deliberately. Colleagues peeked in, some whispering, others pretending not to see. Let them. Their silence told me where their loyalties lay. I placed only essentials in my bag, laptop, a few files, and one very important folder, the agreement that tied me irrevocably to that $50 million fund. As I closed the door to my office for the last time, I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking out with the keys to the company's survival, and I already knew how to use them. That evening, I spread the documents across my desk at home. The clause was airtight. My approval was written into the funding model. Without me, the company couldn't legally access that capital. And with my signature, I could initiate withdrawals, lawfully, transparently, without a shred of illegality. The irony was almost poetic. HR had accused me of financial mismanagement, and yet I was about to deliver the only financial consequence that truly mattered. I drafted the initial withdrawal request. The system recognized my credentials instantly. No red flags, no denials. My authority wasn't just valid, it was absolute. All those years, the CEO had strutted around claiming he was the architect of success, while the Real Foundation rested quietly under my control. By the time the request was logged, the CEO was likely celebrating my exit. HR was probably congratulating herself for protecting the company. Neither of them had the faintest idea that their victory had planted the seed of collapse. In the quiet of my living room, I sat back and let the reality settle. I wasn't stealing. I wasn't plotting in shadows. I was exercising the very power they had handed me, carelessly, arrogantly, believing they would never need me. They had underestimated me. They had forgotten the weight of my signature. They had gambled on a lie, and in doing so, they had set fire to their own house. The first step was complete. The request was in motion. Soon, the absence of that $50 million would echo through every board meeting, every balance sheet, every investor call. The CEO had called me a liability. But the real liability was his arrogance. As I shut down my laptop for the night, one thought lingered. They had severed the one person who understood the bloodstream of their company. Now they were about to learn what it meant to operate without oxygen. The next morning, the first ripple arrived. At precisely 9:14 a.m., my phone buzzed with an automated notification. Withdrawal initiated, awaiting final confirmation. That was the beauty of the structure I had designed. Every step left a trail, every action was auditable, and yet every approval required me alone. My signature, my authority, my oversight. The system was functioning exactly as I had built it. Meanwhile, in the boardroom I no longer occupied, the unease began to spread. Investors had logged in to review their quarterly forecasts, only to find unexpected adjustments in the capital reserves. It wasn't large enough yet to trigger panic, but it was enough to raise questions. I could picture it vividly, the CEO waving his hand, dismissing concerns with his usual arrogance. Minor accounting adjustment. Nothing to worry about. And HR sitting stiffly beside him, silently hoping her manufactured allegations would shield her from scrutiny. But numbers don't respect arrogance. They reveal truth with every update. By the end of that day, the discrepancy had doubled. Quiet calls from investors began to slip through to the finance office. Can you confirm the reserve figures? We're seeing inconsistencies, please advise. The unease was building, not yet visible to the public, but loud enough in private channels to disrupt their comfort. For me, it was simply observation. I had no need to interfere further. The request was in motion, and the company itself was my messenger. That evening, I revisited the documents, reviewing each clause like a surgeon reviewing the anatomy before a procedure. The authority wasn't vague, it was absolute. The board had signed it years ago to appease investors who feared reckless spending. And ironically, it was that very paranoia that had armed me. The CEO had always prided himself on being untouchable. But he had forgotten that every fortress has a gatekeeper. And when you cast out the gatekeeper, you invite collapse. By the second week, the tremors became visible. Payroll faced a delay. Not catastrophic, but enough to irritate employees who had always been paid on time. HR scrambled to manage complaints, but her credibility was already fragile. After all, she had been the architect of my dismissal. Every raised voice in the corridors reminded her of the decision she had championed. I imagined her eyes darting nervously when the first emails hit her inbox. Why hasn't payroll cleared? Finance is stalling, what's happening? Her lies had removed me, but my absence had removed stability. Meanwhile, the CEO doubled down on bravado. To the board, he called it a temporary delay. To staff, he blamed a technical glitch. He believed that dominance in tone could erase weakness in numbers. But arrogance doesn't pay salaries. Arrogance doesn't calm investors. Arrogance doesn't balance ledgers. I stayed quiet, patient. My role now was not to announce myself, but to watch them unravel. At night, I kept a journal. Not emotional ramblings, but cold observations, dates, times, ripple effects. Each entry was a record of how quickly their empire began to fracture without me. I wasn't just withdrawing capital. I was withdrawing certainty. And in corporate life, certainty is worth more than cash. By the third week, the first investor demanded an emergency call. The missing funds had begun to affect projections. Questions sharpened. Where is the oversight? Who authorized this? Why wasn't the board informed? The CEO fumbled. HR shuffled papers. Finance offered rehearsed explanations. But the truth was unavoidable, they didn't know. The capital had moved with proper authority, but the authority no longer sat in their hands. I smiled quietly at the irony. They had fired me on false charges of financial mismanagement. Now they stood helpless, unable to manage the very funds they accused me of mishandling. The panic began to ripple outward. Vendors delayed contracts. Partnerships hesitated on renewals. Even clients noticed the hesitation in the company's tone, the subtle cracks in confidence. Reputation is fragile. Once it bends, it rarely straightens again. Through it all, I remained silent. No grand gestures. No dramatic revelations. Just the steady tightening of a noose they had unknowingly tied for themselves. By the end of the month, whispers reached me through contacts still loyal enough to keep me informed. Investors were losing patience. Some demanded audits. Others threatened withdrawal. The CEO's charisma, once his greatest shield, had begun to wear thin. Charm can buy time, but it cannot buy trust. And HR? She had become the most hated woman in the building. The same employees who once whispered about me now whispered about her. The same allies she thought she had secured now distanced themselves, unwilling to sink with her ship. It was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. Not chaos, not an explosion, but a steady erosion. Stone by stone, their fortress was crumbling. And all I had done was press the first lever. The CEO had called me a liability. But as I closed my journal one evening, another thought crystallized. He was wrong. I wasn't the liability. I was the reckoning. And the cracks they were ignoring now would soon widen into fractures no denial could contain. The following week, I received the first confirmation that the fracture line had reached the boardroom. A contact of mine, one of the quieter board members who had always respected my diligence, sent me a single sentence through a private channel. They're finally asking questions you used to answer. That was all I needed to know. For years, I had been the one fielding investor concerns, translating financial complexity into stability, ensuring the board never panicked. Now, without me, every question was a blade cutting into the CEO's carefully constructed ego. Investors were no longer satisfied with vague assurances. They wanted hard answers. Where had the capital gone? Who approved the movements? Why were reserves shrinking without explanation? The CEO, in his arrogance, responded as he always did, with denial, with posturing, with dismissive bravado. But charisma can only mask numbers for so long. By mid-month, the first investor publicly announced a review of their stake. It was a small statement, just a press release framed in neutral corporate language. But markets read between the lines. Confidence faltered. Share prices dipped. Clients called for clarity. And in that moment, the first fracture became visible to the world outside. I watched silently as news outlets picked up the story. Capital irregularities at leading firm. Investors demand answers amid missing funds. The headlines weren't explosive yet, but they were corrosive. Each one chipped away at reputation, and reputation, once damaged, rarely heals. Inside the company, HR became the lightning rod. Employees blamed her for the instability, whispering that her false crusade against me had unleashed the crisis. She tried to defend herself, insisting she had only acted on credible reports, but credibility is fragile currency. Once spent, it never replenishes. The CEO, desperate to deflect blame, doubled down. He insisted the problem was temporary, that the capital was locked in transitional structures, that outside auditors would verify everything soon. His speeches grew longer, his tone sharper, his promises emptier. But promises don't pay bills. And by the end of the quarter, the fracture widened into a chasm. Payroll missed again, this time for senior managers. Vendors refused to extend terms. 2 partnerships suspended negotiations indefinitely. I documented everything in my journal. Dates, statements, reactions. This wasn't just revenge, it was evidence. Evidence of what happens when arrogance replaces competence. Evidence of how a single false report can boomerang back with devastating force. Still, I remained patient. My plan was never to rush collapse. Collapse is most effective when it arrives gradually, stripping away every illusion layer by layer, until the victim is forced to stare at the truth with no escape. By the 3rd month, the board finally lost its patience. Emergency meetings were called. Investors demanded independent audits. Lawyers began circling, probing for liability exposure. And then came the moment I had anticipated, the CEO's desperate pivot. For the first time since my dismissal, my name was spoken in the boardroom. Not as an afterthought, not as gossip, but as a potential solution. "Where is she now?" one investor asked. "Why was she terminated without due process?" another pressed. "Her oversight was tied to the capital, how do we function without it?" The HR director, once so smug, now stammered. She tried to justify her fabricated reports, but the board wasn't convinced. They demanded documentation. They wanted evidence. They wanted the truth she could not provide. The fracture had widened beyond repair. The very narrative they had constructed against me was now their liability. I smiled at the irony. They had branded me a risk, but in removing me, they had become the risk. As weeks turned into months, the consequences accelerated. Media coverage intensified. Clients withdrew contracts. Investors filed legal motions to protect their interests. The once proud company was now a case study in mismanagement, arrogance, and self-inflicted collapse. And through it all, I remained silent. I didn't rush to the press. I didn't send anonymous leaks. I didn't need to. The system I had designed was speaking for me, louder and clearer than any words could. At night, I returned to my journal. The entries grew longer, sharper, more clinical. I wasn't writing feelings anymore, I was writing history. A record of how truth, patience, and foresight had dismantled lies, arrogance, and recklessness. By the 6th month, the collapse was undeniable. The stock price had plummeted. The board had split into factions. Lawsuits mounted. And finally, the investors delivered their verdict, a formal demand for the CEO's resignation. The same man who had called me a liability, who had dismissed me with cold arrogance, now found himself cornered, stripped of authority, clinging to excuses no one believed. And HR? She was already gone. Quietly dismissed, her reputation in ruins, her career destroyed by the very lies she had built. No one defended her. No one remembered her as anything but the spark that ignited the fire. The fractures had become a collapse. But for me, it wasn't an ending. It was only the threshold of the final act. Because while the company was falling apart, the capital was already secure, under my control, untouched by their chaos. And as I closed my journal one night, a single thought crystallized again. They had fired me to erase me. But I had made sure they could never forget me. The next morning, the board held an emergency session. Investors demanded explanations. Banks were asking about liquidity gaps. Payroll was already delayed for the first time in 10 years. The CEO stumbled through numbers that no longer aligned, projections that dissolved under scrutiny, and promises that rang hollow. Every sentence he spoke was weighted with desperation. Every eye in the room saw him for what he truly was, a fraud propped up by arrogance. I didn't attend, but I didn't have to. My absence was louder than my presence had ever been. They had tried to silence me, yet now every conversation circled back to my name. My departure was no longer a footnote, it was the headline. In the weeks that followed, resignations began piling up. Senior managers distanced themselves, seeking safer shores before the collapse became irreversible. Partners quietly dissolved agreements, unwilling to gamble their reputations on sinking ground. The CEO's inner circle shrank to a handful of loyalists, loyal not out of conviction, but out of fear. Meanwhile, I moved with precision. The capital I had withdrawn wasn't idle. It became seed money, structured, protected, and multiplied through careful planning. Where they saw ruin, I saw foundation. Where they drowned in debt, I was already charting expansion. The irony was sharp. They had accused me of being a liability, but I was the only asset they could never afford to lose. And now, stripped of me, the company they had worshipped as untouchable was nothing more than a cautionary tale. One evening, as headlines finally broke, CEO faces investor backlash amid sudden financial crisis, I closed my laptop and allowed myself a rare smile. Not because of revenge, but because truth had finally surfaced. A truth they had buried beneath false HR reports, manufactured complaints, and boardroom whispers. They had written me out of their future. I had written them out of existence. And so, the final act wasn't about destruction. It was about reclamation. My voice. My worth. My future. The company would vanish, swallowed by its own arrogance. But I remained, stronger, unbroken, and holding the very wealth they once used to measure my silence. In the end, they didn't fire me. They freed me. And the world would remember not the CEO's downfall, but the reckoning he brought upon himself. Subscribe for more corporate revenge stories, where power, arrogance, and strategy collide.